This week we are going to just cover some plants of various growth forms, growth habits that are flowering right now. On our list soon will be pine trees and succulents, some larger categories. But first, I wanted to do this kind of various life form and growth habit list just to run through a few of the things that are blooming right now so that you can see them in their prime. This will be list 2A, which is when it starts to get really difficult. List 1 is still new to you, and so it's easy to remember the first 10, the first 20 plants. And it will be easy at the end because you will have developed a routine and you will have worked out your brain a little bit and developed some pathways to more easily remember. But it's in the middle of the class when we reach a plateau, and it will become difficult for you to learn and memorize these plants. Additionally, some of the names are going to get a few more syllables in there, so it'll be a little more tricky. And when you look back upon this semester, the middle portion will likely be the ones that are hardest for you to remember. So it's important for you to put a little extra effort toward your studies, and it will be helpful for you to come back and review these later, and that will really help to cement them in place. Here's plant list 2A, life forms and growth habits. There are many life forms that plants can take. The first plant on our list is Cercis canadensis, the eastern redbud. And it is just starting to come into flower right now. The eastern redbud is named commonly for its red buds. So you can see the pink flowers on the right-hand side. And you can tell that this is in the Fabaceae family, the legume family, because those flowers that you see are very characteristic of anything in the bean family. So the flowers are described as having a banner, wings, and a keel. So there's kind of an upright petal in the back. There's two petals on either side that form the wings. And then there's the keel, kind of like a boat-shaped flower, which all of the legumes tend to have. Being a legume, this plant has a beneficial association with bacteria that doesn't need any extra nitrogen. So this small tree grows pretty well, is very hardy, and it can grow in many different climates, all the way from Canada with the name canadensis down to Florida. It's part of its native range, but then we also see it planted out here in California as well. In the forest ecology, these legume trees tend to have the ability to kind of provide nitrogen for other species as well. So if you're trying to create sort of a mixed woodland forest, then mixing in some legumes is a great idea. And this one is ornamental as well, popular in our landscape. One of the primary cultivars that we see is called forest pansy. And the center image is an image of forest pansy. And what makes forest pansy unique is that when the leaves just begin to emerge, they have a red color. Now, this tree is deciduous, meaning it will drop its leaves. And when it drops its leaves, it also displays sort of a fall foliage color as well. But forest pansy, when the new leaves emerge, you see this red color. And the eastern redbud has a heart-shaped leaf. So notice on the left-hand side, the leaf has a point in the apex. And so with forest pansy in particular, you get these little red hearts all over the tree, which a lot of people like. So it's pretty easy to identify this tree in all of its stages. You're looking for the heart-shaped leaf. If it's a cultivar, you're looking for the red color in the young leaves. And the red bud, the flowers will emerge when the tree is bare. So you'll have no leaves or maybe small leaves visible and lots of pink flowers. There can be some other colors, but typically sort of a deep pink is the flower color. We do have a native Western redbud as well, but we'll cover that one soon. The way to identify it when it has no leaves and no flowers is to look at the branches. And there's a very characteristic zigzag pattern on the branches. And even that, in my opinion, is kind of geometric and really interesting to look at. Cercis canadensis makes a great focal point. It's a good street tree or a patio tree. It's not going to lift up the sidewalk. It's valuable habitat. The flowers are attracting to birds, hummingbirds in particular. Things come to get the nectar. And it's tolerant of shade, so it's a good tree to have under a larger tree. So in the forest, this would be kind of an understory plant. Because it's not a true native plant, it's a medium water use in our region. So you will need to make sure you irrigate it if it's going to do well. But if you mix it in with a zone where all the plants are medium water use, you'll have a very valuable tree that can bring a lot of unique year-round interest to your landscape. So here we have Cercis canadensis, Eastern redbud. Now we have a plant that is common to many. This is Crassula ovata, the jade plant, sometimes called money plant, although there's a few other plants commonly called money plant. And so jade plant is one of the common names that's unique. This is a succulent, meaning that it's not a woody shrub species. It's succulent in nature, but it can grow to be 3 to 4 feet tall, similar to many of our shrubs around town. This, like many succulents, this species comes from South Africa as well as Mozambique. And there are several cultivated varieties that you can find. Some of them are totally green in the leaf. There are variegated varieties, meaning they have kind of a yellow or light green stripe. And then there's cultivated varieties that have more red on the tips. And the image we see here shows some red on the tips, which is characteristic of the standard species. This plant is flowering right now. So this time of year, we have little 5-petaled flowers, and they're typically white or maybe pink or cream in color. And they can be quite conspicuous. The images show them looking rather minor compared to the leaves, but certain plants will have lots of flowers, and so it can be a very showy element of the plant. Primarily, though, this plant is prized for its evergreen nature, its hardiness, very low water use, and its ability to thrive in San Diego with very little care. Doesn't need fertilizer, doesn't need water. And in fact, if you go to old landscapes or parks that have been neglected or forgotten, this one kind of ends up being one of the species that thrives beyond human attention. So if we were all to disappear tomorrow, some of our cultivated gardens would end up becoming covered in jade plant. This is a fairly common house plant throughout the world. And so in climates that are not appropriate for growing this outside, a lot of people keep it in a container and grow it indoors, which tells you that it is good for containers as well. Here in San Diego, we can grow it in the ground with no problems. And you see it quite commonly in our landscape. Being succulent in nature means that this plant is pretty hardy to wind, and so it can form a decent windbreak It's a low growing windbreak, but it's good along margins where you may have some extra wind coming in and you want to create a little bit of a microclimate. Plant some jade in order to help slow down that wind. And additionally, it gives that tropical effect because of its round and evergreen leaves. And so it can be planted as sort of a tropical effect in and around swimming pools or ponds. A lot of people like to place them there. And it even has a home in a very unique kind of garden aesthetic that people call the underwater garden or under the sea garden, because it kind of looks Dr. Seuss-esque, or it looks a little bit like a coral, some sort of living, colorful underwater plant or coral. And so in some unique settings, you may see these plants prized. It's very tolerant to pruning. You can cut it and hedge it. You can make new cuttings very easily. And you can even have this as a bonsai tree. So it can be pruned to stay very low growing and small and will continue to live for a very long time. One thing to note about jade plant is that it is toxic to animals, including humans. Most people don't want to eat it, but you would want to keep this away from your animals. And in some people, it can cause dermatitis or some kind of an allergic reaction in your skin, which is the case for many types of succulent species. This one is not extreme in its irritability, at least not as extreme as some of the others we'll talk about today. If that's a concern, you may want to avoid selecting this plant. So here we have Crassula ovata, jade plant. And next up, we have Eschscholtzia californica, the California poppy. This is an annual, so it's a low-growing herbaceous plant, kind of like what we call perennials, although this one is an annual, meaning it will disappear at the end of one season, and it will drop a ton of seeds. This is the state flower of California, which is why it has the name California poppy. Quite common in our state, as well as a common invasive species in New Zealand and a few other places. It has this very bright, vibrant golden color, which is like no other, really. Attracts pollinators, in particular bees, are attracted to this plant. Every now and then we get a year where there's a super bloom of the California poppy. A few years ago we had that, and people will go and be tourists and try to get to the fields where the California poppy is pretty much the only thing blooming, and it's a quite spectacular display. This plant is quite hardy. It will grow in roadsides and rocky gravel outcrops. It's a pioneer species, so after a fire or a burn, you often see a lot of California poppy. And it's one that is planted as a seed in new construction sites. So if you have a slope or any exposed soil, oftentimes they will apply a special kind of mulch with a machine. And as they apply that mulch, they can add poppy seeds. And so this one will pop up in the next several years to help establish newly planted landscapes. As the landscape matures, you tend to see less and less California poppy, but it'll always have a certain place in the ecosystem. The poppy seeds are edible, although this plant is not as prolific in producing seeds as some of the other poppies where seeds are harvested. The scientific name can be difficult to remember, and it's typically pronounced Eschscholtzia californica. It's named after a person. And you have to remember that it has the SCH combo because it's hard to pronounce all three of those letters. And not only is it SCH, but then it's a second SCH. So a unique spelling that can be tricky to remember. is Schultzia californica. Because it's native, it's a very low water use plant. There's a rumor out there that because it's the state flower, that it's illegal to pick one. And that is sort of correct. You don't have the legal right to pick any flowers that are on protected land. So picking California poppies in areas that are protected is illegal. But if it's on the roadside or if you grow it yourself in your garden, you can harvest this plant with no issues. There's no reason that that every single one planted is protected. They do come in several other cultivated varieties that include kind of a pink or a reddish color, even some white in the petals sometimes, although our standard species is just a single solid golden orange color. There are 4 petals, and they're quite papery or fragile, very delicate looking, and they will only open on a sunny day. So if the sun is behind clouds, you'll see the flowers stay closed. And then once the sun emerges, the poppies open up with their sort of silky textured petals. In other Mediterranean climates, this plant has a potential to become an invasive species. It has taken off in Chile and in South Africa and in Australia, as well as New Zealand. And so it's one that if you go other places, you want to use caution planting. But if you're in California, it's always a good idea to throw down some poppy seed and try to get it to establish. It's one that is easy to harvest the seed from. The seed pod will dry out, and once it reaches a certain pressure inside, the pod will burst. And the seed dispersal strategy for this plant is explosion. The pod opens up and explodes and shoots the seeds out far and wide. So if you gather some pods and leave them on a sunny windowsill or leave them in your car and forget that they will explode, you'll come back later. The pods will have burst open and you'll have tiny little seeds everywhere. But now is the time to see it. The California poppy is Schultzia californica. Pay attention, keep an eye out for the state flower, the California poppy. And next up, we have another succulent. This is Euphorbia Tirakali, the pencil tree, sometimes called pencil plant or the pencil cactus. It's also called the milk bush because it has a thick latex sap that looks milky in color. It's white. And it's notorious for being toxic, just like the jade plant, but this one is much more toxic. So people like this plant as an ornamental. And if you wanted to have some kind of poisonous garden, then you'd also want this plant. Here in the images, we see it as a shrub, although it can become quite a large tree over time with a significant trunk. It's not a woody tree, but it is one that will get quite large and multiple feet in diameter over time. Here we see it up against a white wall in a Spanish colonial type of a house. And on the left-hand image, we see one of the most popular cultivated varieties called sticks on fire or fire sticks. People call it Euphorbia sticks on fire. And that's a special variety that was found in South Africa and introduced in Southern California. The standard species is just pure green in color, and a lot of people prefer the fire sticks, but you see both of them planted throughout San Diego quite commonly. They're very low water use, very hardy plants. They require very little extra irrigation, and they will thrive on neglect. You see them sometimes on commercial landscapes, on sides of freeways and roadsides. A lot of times you see them in front yards. People plant them as ornamental plants. And lately, I've noticed a trend of people wanting to remove them or telling other people get rid of them because of how toxic they are. And there's a fear that you'll go blind if you rub your eye, which potentially could happen. So you do want to exercise caution with this plant. I don't think you need to have as much fear as everyone else says you do, but you just need to be wise. Don't be foolish when it comes to working with this plant. Wash your hands between touching this plant and eating, or even right after you work with this plant. Wash your hands with soap and water. You'll be fine. And it doesn't require much attention, although it will get large. So if you leave it in a specific place and don't plan for its growth, it can become problematic. A lot of plants from the Euphorbia genus are coastal in nature. We have native euphorbias as well, and this one is no exception. This thrives on the coast. So if you are close to the ocean and you have salts in the air, salt spray, this one will do okay there. It's wind resistant and somewhat salt resistant. It can grow in a container in a large pot, although you want to make sure that eventually you remove it because it will get really large and potentially break the pot in time. This is another plant that would have that under the sea characteristic, giving you sort of the coral type aesthetic, and the color in particular with the reddish of the fire sticks would really suggest kind of a coral type plant. So a lot of people plant it for its unique otherworldly aesthetic. So there we have Euphorbia Tirakali, pencil tree. And next up, we have one that will be difficult for you to memorize because it has many syllables. Once we get into 5 syllables plus, it becomes tricky. So you have Handroanthus, that's 4. And then we have Impetigonosus, that's 6. So a lot of syllables in this name. Handroanthus impetigonosus. This is the pink trumpet tree. It is currently in bloom, and it's in the Bignonia family. Do you remember our other tree from the Bignonia family thus far? The jacaranda. So jacaranda flowers when there are no leaves, and you see nothing but purple. Here you see nothing but pink. And we have a little bit earlier flower season for the pink trumpet tree. This one has a broad range, goes from central Mexico down to southern tropical America, so South America in the Amazon. One of the common names is Podiarco, which is also the name of a medicine that people take. The bark of this tree is used for all sorts of herbal remedies. Although I am no doctor nor herbologist, so I will not give you a recommendation. When this tree is in flower, it's very easy to recognize, and it definitely commands your attention. Once the flowers have fallen, it can be more difficult to identify. Pay attention to the leaf on the right-hand side and notice that the leaflets are serrate in their margin, and they have a pointed tip, but then notice the arrangement and how there are 5 leaflets. So this is palmately compound. Once you see that, that's how you can be sure that you're looking at a pink trumpet tree. This will produce seed pods that are quite long as well, up to a foot and a half long. They look like they're legume seeds, like a bean type of a tree, although this is not related to the Fabaceae family. And then additionally, the bark of this tree can be quite characteristic. You'll have vertical lines. So typically you'll have a lighter gray color, relatively smooth, and then you'll have vertical lines that look like splits. So it looks like the tree is kind of splitting open on the bark as it grows. And that is one of the ways to identify this without the pink flowers. This is a moderate water use plant. It does quite well in parks, planted in and around turf grass even. So if you are looking for a park tree, this is a popular one. It's good for patios, good for courtyards, and is a good street tree as well. It will drop the flowers and kind of make a little bit of a mess at the time, but for the most part, it's a tidy tree that does not lift up sidewalk or streets. And it definitely will give you sort of a subtropical look and a feel. And in the late winter, early spring, you certainly get quite a stunning show. A lot of people in the horticultural trades have been slow to adopt the new name. This new name, Andranthus impetigonosus, is more difficult to remember and not as fun to say as the old name. The old name, the genus, was Tababuya. So a lot of people still just call this a Tababuya tree. And when you hear that, you'll just have to remember, oh, that's now Andranthus impetigonosus. In addition to the bark being medicinal, the wood is a very highly prized wood for making furniture and building things out of. And it has a name of Ipe. Some people call it Brazil wood, although both of those names are applied to many different kinds of trees as well. But it has a very tight grain and very deep, rich color that makes the wood prized for furniture or woodworking of all sorts. And in fact, the harvest of the wild species of this plant is actually problematic, and a lot of wild specimens are being removed in order to be sold on the market for their wood, and it's leading to a lot of deforestation in the Amazon. Here in Southern California, we have it primarily as a landscape plant, and people don't tend to think about any of the other economic or useful nature of the tree. And we've had it in our landscape for many, many years. It's a Southern California standard, especially on the ornamental side. And in particular, if you go to Disneyland and you're walking down Main Street and you go to where that big fountain in the middle and the castle and all that, if you go at this time of year, you'll see the pink trumpet trees in full bloom and definitely add to that sort of fairy tale nature of Disneyland. So there we have the Andranthus impetigonosus pink trumpet tree. Next up, we have another very vibrant flowering plant, and this one is a ground cover and a succulent. You will see it out and about right about now. This is Lampranthus Productus, and it has many common names. Typically, people call it purple ice plant. So ice plant is a name that's applied to many different types of succulents. Some of them are related to each other and some of them are not. And this is one that most of the year thrives in our dry soils, and you would never pay any attention to it except in late winter when these purple flowers start to bloom and they are quite vibrant. They will definitely attract your attention. And notice that genus name, Lampranthus. So the flowers are bright like a lamp. So that's how I remember this genus. It's very bright, almost looks like there's a light behind it that's causing it to be brighter than anything should be. So take a look right about now. You'll see these on hillsides, roadsides, in people's landscapes. A lot of times you see this in the backcountry around the large homes that are built out in the hills, and they'll surround themselves with this Lampranthus because it is a fire-wise plant. It does not burn. And so you'll see this ground cover out in large areas surrounding houses, and people plant it so that it does not cause their house to be at risk of burning. There are many different species within the Lampranthus genus, and there's a lot of trade names and cultivated varieties. So sometimes people just refer to them all as Lampranthus. And there's another one we will learn about in a few weeks that is more on the red side of flowering. All of these plants are susceptible to frost, so they do not do well in areas where the temperature gets below freezing because of how they store water inside the organs of the plant. So freezing water will expand, and therefore it becomes one that only goes in coastal conditions or places where it's relatively mild climate. And you can buy these oftentimes in a flat. So instead of buying individual plants, you can buy like a flat of soil that is just covered with this as a ground cover. And then you take that home and you divide that up, and you can plant that out over a broad area. And eventually the plant fills in and will create a pretty wide area of just covered ground for you. So instead of buying like a 1 gallon or number one container, usually you buy a flat, and you can divide that up as much as you need. Very easy to propagate with cuttings. And so if you see some out there in a public place and you'd like some at home, take a responsible cutting and don't hurt the plant at all. But you've got yourself some Lampranthus. It's nice to have some plants that flower at the end of winter, because just when things are feeling cold and miserable, you get a little burst of color that lets you know spring is on the way. And now we've got another quite common plant in the landscape. This is limonium perezii, and we commonly call it sea lavender. This comes from the Canary Islands, where it has a Spanish name. And in the Canary Islands, it's actually a vulnerable plant. So the conservation status, this plant is at risk in its native habitat, which is a little bit ironic because here it's a little bit of an invasive species. We have a few other limonium species that are much more of a problem, especially if you get into our salt marsh habitat right on the coast. This one tends to not get into that particular habitat. And so usually you see it in places coastal in nature, and dry, sandy slopes is where it thrives. The flowers are quite unique. Notice they are purple and white, and this particular limonium has a very big flower cluster. And these flowers persist for a long time. You can even cut the flower, and then the flower will stay on the stalk and will dry. So you'll end up with a dried flower, but you would never know it because it just keeps its color and keeps its shape. So for that reason, it's a very popular plant in the floral industry. Here in San Diego, it's one that you may want to be cautious against planting because of its tendency to become invasive. But in a highly urban area or in a place where it doesn't have a risk of jumping over your fence and going to a wild habitat, you're going to be just fine. It's not going to be spread by birds or wildlife. This one just does so well in neglected areas that it tends to get out into our coastal sea cliffs or highly disturbed habitats, sometimes on the sides of freeways. And it grows perfectly fine in our climate. So use responsible judgment when selecting this plant. So it can do okay in containers or pots. It can be good next to swimming pools. It can be trampled a little bit and do just fine. It's resistant to animals grazing it. It's a perennial, meaning it's kind of herbaceous and tends to grow to be about 3 feet tall. But there is a woody rhizome or an underground stem that's woody that helps to cause this to keep coming back, even if you cut it down or get rid of it on the surface. So it's quite hardy. It'll be persistent in the landscape. And most of the time, people like that. The florists, they tend to call this plant status. So status is the floral name, the trade name. And sometimes people call this the sea foam status or just status. And in the landscape, we tend to just call it sea lavender. A lot of people just say limonium. It's a very widely cultivated plant and a good one to consider in a Mediterranean garden. So here we have limonium, perezii, sea lavender. And next up we have osteospermum fruticosum, trailing African daisy. Here's another one, osteospermum, 5 syllables. So that's going to be tough to remember. Just break it down into parts. Osteo is actually referencing bone, like osteoporosis. So osteospermum can call this the bone seed. It's not a common name that people typically use. They call it African daisy. Some people call it the freeway daisy. It's from South Africa, so it's perfectly climate appropriate. And this is one that's a bit weedy. So people used to plant it a lot, and they still do in circumstances. But wherever you plant it, be ready for it to spread. And so if you are irrigating an area and you've got some African daisy, this plant is so hardy, it's going to fill in the gaps, which can be a really nice thing if that's what you're looking for. But you want to make sure that it's not going to cause problems in the landscape or go out beyond your fence line. It's really interesting that this plant will give you white flowers and purple pinkish flowers all on the same plant. And so there's a variety of color here. And this is a true Asteraceae, the sunflower family, where you see the center disc, which are their own flowers, and then the petals around it, the ray flowers. So that's a composite flower, meaning that's actually a cluster of many types of flowers, many little flowers in that center. Flower structure, which makes pollination very efficient. This has a relatively long bloom season, starts in the fall and continues through winter. In the summer, it will take a little bit of a break, but really it depends on the microclimate and the amount of irrigation. If you keep watering it and if there's a little bit of shade, it'll keep flowering year round. It's very hardy and forms a really nice ground cover. It's good for coastal gardens, and even at night, it forms some nighttime interest when on a full moon you can see those white flowers popping out. So that would be what we call the moon garden. There are some really interesting cultivated varieties. There's one in particular where the petals tend to look like spoons. And so they've got many different names, but you can find such a unique flower when the petal is very thin but then has a spoon at the end, a rounded shape. And that's a cultivated variety that you can find for osteospermum. So common in our landscape, beautiful addition as a ground cover, and not one that you see people planting too much or selecting for new landscapes, but in the older established landscapes and in certain circumstances, this can be a great addition. So here we have osteospermum fruticosum, the trailing African daisy. And now we have another very common plant in the landscape. This is Raffia lepis indica, the Indian hawthorn, one of the most common plants in the commercial landscape because it's very hardy. This plant tolerates hedging and turning into a tight, compact shrub. You can also trim this and prune it to be a small tree. Beautiful pink flowers this time of year in March and April. And also has cultivated varieties that have white flowers or deep pink red in color. I find that a lot of people in the horticultural trades, but mainly the ones who are just getting into it and starting to learn things about plants, they'll say some bad things about this plant because it's so common. They'll kind of trash the landscapes that are just Raffia lepis. But I think if you consider this plant to be boring, well, maybe it's just been planted in a boring way. It's quite a stunning plant when you really stop to observe it, and it can be applied in a perfectly unique and characteristic way that shows off the beauty of the plant, as opposed to more of a functional way that just fills up space and stays green. So, personally, there's nothing wrong with this plant, in my opinion. It's more about the design and how it is applied, whether or not it's a good choice or a bad choice. But you'll get some people trashing this plant, which I think is not fair. A lot of people will use the name Raphiolepis, so they add an S in there after the P. Be cautious though, there's not an S back there, so it's not Raphiolepis, it's Raphiolepis indica, Indian hawthorn. This plant will produce a berry, a hawthorn berry, after it's been pollinated, and it is edible, although not something that's quite as palatable as a fruit tree, but you can make it into a jam or a little bit of a chutney. This comes from Asia, from southern China and the subtropics of Southeast Asia. It can grow together with itself to form a really nice hedge. And so it can be formal in its shape, or it can be left to grow a little bit more natural and wild. And in both ways, looks really nice as a hedge. It creates a impenetrable barrier, and it creates a visual screen, which is really nice. It's in the Rosaceae family, so the rose family, and all the rose family plants have flowers with 5 petals, similar to apples and some of our other fruit trees. This plant is a good one for slopes, so it will do just fine on slopes and help to stabilize soil. If you've got a pesky area that is a little bit on the steep side and you want something larger than a ground cover, this would be one that you could put in its place, and it could pretty much take care of itself and every now and then give you a spectacular bloom, but otherwise give you a nice evergreen foliage. New growth tends to be a little on the orange side, so you get a little bit of a kind of a rusty or an orange color. And then as the plant matures, the leaves turn deep green. All in all, a hardy, tried and true classic plant in our landscape that can be a prized focal or blend in to the background. So here we have Raphiolepis indica, Indian hawthorn. And last but not least, we have Rosa banksiae. This is the Lady Banks rose. So it's in the Rosaceae family, and this is Rosa genus. So this is the type genus for the family. All of our roses are in the Rosa genus. And Rosa banksiae is a little bit unique because it's a true vine. This will grow up and over fences, and in particular, it grows over the arbors, which makes kind of a nice gate or an entrance to a garden. A little bit different from some of the more shrub-like roses. These have smaller blooms, and they tend to have a trailing nature, so they can be quite graceful in their look. They're primarily white in their color, although there is a cultivated variety that gives you a deep yellow, which is also highly prized. So this would not be a rose that you would plant on the ground to act like a shrub in a rose garden, but it's more for the fence line or for, like I said, the gate or the entryway to a landscape. As a vine species, this one doesn't require that much maintenance. It's relatively well behaved, kind of stays where you put it. It will send up new growth year after year, and there's a little bit of thorn on this, although not too much when you compare it to other rose species. And over time, you can trim this back and keep it small and compact. But if you let it go for a few years without any maintenance or care, it will continue to stay evergreen and give you a long bloom season and be a nice addition to any landscape. It's good for multi-purposes. Softens the edges of the hardscape. This plant has probably been in cultivation for a long time, hundreds of years at least, throughout China, its native range. And so we have it in Western landscapes as an introduction from Chinese gardens. But in its native habitat, it's been cultivated for so long that it's really become a plant worthy of merit in the garden. It's a good choice for a lot of conditions. It's a good one for you to be aware of, and it's in bloom right now. So when you see it, pay attention to it, and you'll be able to observe the Lady Banks rose, Rosa Banksiae, in all of its glory. So there we have our next 10 plant species. Remember I said plant list 2 is when it's going to get a little bit tough because it's no longer new. You have to work a little bit more to add it to your list of plants that you're accumulating, but you're still new at the process. So you're going to have to work a little bit harder to keep this one down. But there's a lot of beautiful plants out there. We're just getting into the spring season and things are starting to bloom. So now's the time to really start opening your eyes and paying attention to what's out there. Go look for these plants this week in the landscape. Tell me what you really enjoyed learning about, and then we'll take our quiz and we'll see how we do. I hope you enjoyed this lecture and find the information to be informative, entertaining, useful in your daily life, and opening up a world that you never knew was there right in front of you. Thanks a lot.